Hi, I'm Ray Osman. I'm Managing Director of ROM Ancient Cultures, and I'm here with some friends in one of the collections rooms behind the scenes at the ROM. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we each do. We're all archaeologists, what we do as archaeologists here at the ROM, and what archaeology is all about. And this is especially in preparation for the game jam that we're having next weekend at the ROM, but for anyone who's interested, if you have questions, you can tweet them to us. The hashtag is ROMHang. So as I mentioned, my name's Ray, and I did my fieldwork in Italy, and I was looking at the transition from Roman period, from Etruscan to Roman period, and then into late antiquity.
I'm Daniel. I'm a U of T graduate student. I'm a teacher with ROM's programs over here. I worked in Jordan. I did 3 field seasons in a town called Madaba, and right now I'm studying the mineralogy of pottery from Hokkaido, Japan, early Jomon period.
My name is Robert. I'm an archaeologist that works in the Middle East mostly. Until recently, I've been working in Syria, but I haven't been there lately, and now I'm looking for somewhere else to work. So if you know anywhere nice to dig up, let me know.
Hi, my name's Kay, and I work here at the ROM looking after Greek and Roman collections, but I also am an archaeologist who works in Central America, specifically in the Maya area.
So we all work different places all around the world. I wonder if somebody wants to offer, Kay, maybe you, a basic definition of what archaeology is and what we do as archaeologists.
Well, archaeologists basically study humans and human behavior in the past. And so we try and reconstruct how humans lived and their lifeways in the past using various different lines of evidence. And usually it's physical evidence gathered by either survey or excavation, and various technical analyses that can happen to objects and things that we dig up once we bring them back to the lab. So that's kind of my definition of it. Other people?
Well, I would say archaeologists are adventurers, and we travel the world finding really cool stuff and bringing it alive. We find dead things and bring them alive to try and impact people's lives today. I can either just because I think it's cool, or by trying to understand the lifeways of the people of the past, we can help people understand themselves. I think that's an important part of what archaeologists do, is finding out cool things, but also then sharing it with the public. And I think that would be an important part of this game jam, is to have all these gamers making games that will help communicate what we know to the public as a whole. So I think that's an exciting part of this whole project.
Yeah, we're storytellers, and I think with the game jam, we're definitely making the past very relevant to the present. We're showing people that the past is important, and you can't really have a past, you know. You need it. It's like a tree. Your life is like a tree, and your past are your roots. And if you don't have your roots, your tree can't stand up really strong. And that's what I tell my students. The past is really important to understand, because it's how we go about our lives now.
And innovations of the future are based on things that have happened and been created in the past.
Do any of you have an example of, I don't know, something you found in the field, or just something really memorable, really meaningful that kind of crystallized for you why the past is important? I remember one of our colleagues, April, mentioning that one time when she was working, her thumb, it just sort of fit right into a spot where the person who'd built a brick in the past, where their thumb had made an impression, and that just sort of was this amazing connection of suddenly realizing, you know, a person made this and people lived here, and kind of really bringing it to life.
Yeah, and connections happen all the time. And it's often that you find something that's never been seen before, or you find something very, very personal. And basically that's one of the things that defines archaeologists. They're interested in ordinary human beings of the past. And so looking for the traces of how this potter made this piece of pottery. And to understand it as an archaeologist, to say the difference between this piece of pottery made here or made somewhere else, you need to understand the potter, how they moved, and used their hands to make the piece of pottery. So by that way, every time we look at something, if we're doing it properly, we are getting into the minds of the people who made these things. And so that is a part of it. Every day, every time we look at something, we are stepping into the minds of the people of the past.
And so what are some of the kinds of analysis that we use here at the ROM, or that you've used in the field, that kind of help us get special insight?
Well, we do all sorts of analytical work here, because as a museum, and we also do university teaching and this sort of thing as well. But as a museum, a lot of our emphasis is on stuff, the stuff in the collections. And so we're often working on stuff that's been excavated decades and decades ago. And so we'll use certain analytical techniques. For instance, here we have a project which just happens to be in front of us, honest. And here, this is pottery from the Sudan, of a culture called the Meroitic culture. And here you can see someone has been cutting off pieces of it. See, like this. And you put it on a glass slide, and you look at it in a microscope. We have all these microscopes, scanning from microscopes and things like this, to look at the material. In this case, what we want to do is characterize the minerals and the rocks inside, because that will tell us where the pottery was made. And so by doing this, we can see where it was made. Was it made locally? Is it imported from somewhere else? And we can create these patterns of communication, which are very important to understand how people lived in the past. And one of the things we study in particular is pottery. And a lot of people think, wow, why do you study pottery? It's really boring. And that's what you tend to think until you start studying it, really understanding it, because pottery is the most common type of artifact. And most other sorts of materials can be recycled, and metals and glass in the past, typically most of the metals and glass has been recycled and made into something else. Things like wood and basketry rot away and don't exist anymore. So that's one of the reasons we study pottery. It's not that pottery was necessarily important to the person that made it, but it's very important to us. It's quite often we can dig up an archaeological site, and the only thing we find there is pottery. And so to understand those people, understand their lives, we have to look at pottery in all kinds of really weird, wild ways.
The great thing about pottery is that, like, it's also very persistent in the archaeological record. We find it all the time. But it's also that it was used as a container.
Yes.
Some of the traded items that we're looking at might not be around anymore. But using residue analysis of pottery, or looking at thin sections of pots and fabrics and the clay and paste recipes that people were actually making, we can actually look at them as containers. It's like looking at Tupperware and seeing, if I took my Tupperware to China and left it there, somebody took Chinese Tupperware, took it over here, we can see where the Tupperware came from and what people were doing with them.
So how do we decide where to excavate? That's something that kids have asked me. Is how do you know where to dig? How do you choose a site, or how do you?
Sometimes we find sites by accident. The site that I worked on in Jordan, they found it by accident. People were renovating their backyard and found a mosaic. And they told the government, and the government shut down their construction and bought the land, and we turned it into a site, and we excavated it, starting in 1998, and the dig ended in 2012, this year.
Yeah, there was actually one time when I was in the field in Belize, and we were actually working on a site already when we were called by the local authorities. And they were preparing to put a row of houses in, and so a bulldozer had come along and scraped the side of what just looked like a little rise, but it actually turned out to be an over 15-meter long platform, ancient Maya platform dating from 200 or 300 BC, with all sorts of pottery, burials, evidence of bead manufacture. They were making shell beads. We found all of the debris from all of those different types of activities. So it was really quite out of the blue. And there was a project going on nearby where we were working at, so we were sort of called in to do that work. And so it was sort of a little bit of rescue archaeology as well.
And we bring up.
Do also look for them.
Yeah.
And an important part of the work we do is just wandering, and in my case in Syria, looking across the desert, looking for usage of the land, and I find prehistoric burial mounds and circles of stones and things like this, when really I'm just looking to see how monks lived at this monastery in the desert where I was working. But that happens everywhere. And Kay has done transects, as they're called, walking in a straight line through the jungle, which you can imagine is very difficult. And our work in the desert is much easier,
Yeah.
but it's across the desert. Guys walk across the desert and it's not a problem. But in the jungle, trees.
Yeah.
But it depends on what kind of jungle too.
We were surveying a site last summer in Mount Nebo, and it was a large hill and a tell, and we were looking out, and off into the distance, maybe a couple kilometers away, was a stone circle, a Chalcolithic stone circle, and it was just visible from our elevated position. So it's just really important to just keep your eyes open and look down and around.
Mm-hmm. Well, using Google Earth, actually, you can pick out a lot of monumental structures, even in the jungle, but certainly in the desert.
So I think one thing that has come up that you've all mentioned is kind of context. And so there's the context of your site, your monastery, kind of in its natural environment. And then Kay, you mentioned, you know, if you're excavating a site, you find all of the little remains of the pieces of craft. So can we talk a little bit about when archaeologists are excavating, what they're looking for, not just artifacts, but what else? What are they documenting and keeping track of?
We're looking at the natural geography, because we can make hypotheses about where our sites could potentially be based on the location of, say, important things like water, maybe obsidian, or other resources. We could look for evidence of, depending on the time period, agriculture, farming, to kind of put us in the right sort of area, and then we can sort of narrow in our searches for other sites. So we do surface surveys, we do aerial photography, and ground penetrating radar. We're trying to use everything around us to find something very specific.
But more and more these days, especially with graduate students going through programs and doing master's and PhD programs, archaeologists are actually being encouraged to look at problems and create a research design sort of to address those problems. So, you know, one person might say, I want to know about how agriculture developed in this part of the world. What would be the best way to answer that question, to find out more about that? And say, okay, well, we want to do a survey of land and see if we can find sites dating to a certain period where we have an idea of when agriculture was first developing. Then we might want to look for remains or traces of that. You might want to look at cores from lakes to analyze pollen from domesticates, if you were looking for early corn domestication or something like that, or test soil, but also even look for implements that might have processed the corn, like manos and metates or grinding stones. So there's all sorts of different levels, but more and more these days, archaeologists are being encouraged to have a question, have a problem, and then construct a research design. What is the best way to access that problem and get information that will allow you to answer those kinds of questions? So sometimes it's just going out there and finding a site. Sometimes it's like, well, you know, we want to know about trade. We want to know about agriculture. We want to know about you know, households and how they function. We want to know about pottery industries, or how stone tools were made and mined, where they got raw materials from. There are all sorts of questions that come up that just people want to know, and then to try and access that.
In my case, one of the reasons I was working at this monastery in the desert was to find out how people can survive the desert, to see how that can be applied to making the desert come to life again. And it was really quite productive work in that regard, until I had to stop doing it.
In my case, the pottery that I studied, it was excavated in the late 70s and the early 80s, and it had been sitting around in the ROM, traveled to the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and had been sitting there, and nobody had actually really done a lot with it. And so I thought, well, I wanted to learn more about petrography, and Rob's been training me, and still is, and I'm still learning, and I thought this would be a perfect starting point for a project. And that's how I got started. So I used a pre-existing collection that nobody had really paid too much attention to in terms of petrography and mineralogy.
So getting more information about
Exactly.
So so let's talk a little bit about the advantages of maybe comparing different case studies around the world, because we're all working in different places, and the two of you are using similar methods, but working in different places. is there an advantage, or what is the advantage of archaeology being such a broad field where we can look at people across different times and different places, kind of answer big questions?
Well, actually, I use petrology in looking at Maya pottery. And so it was sort of interesting because with the Maya material, there were Mayanists, or people looking at Maya material archaeologically, had made all sorts of categories and names and varieties and types of pottery in a quite elaborate scheme. And basically this whole construction dated the pottery. So you could tell whether it was from 750 AD or 650 BC. And basically that's all they were using pottery for, was, okay, we can date a site with it. Some of it's utilitarian, everyday sort of household stuff. Some of it's the fine china that you bring out for feasts and special occasions. But other than that, they really weren't using pottery for much else. When I started doing the petrography on it, we were looking at the actual minerals that were in the clay and the rocks that were in the clay, and we're able to say, oh, well, this stuff is actually locally made because it's full of limestone and calcium carbonate. And the underlying bedrock of the area that I was working in was all limestone. But then there was this other stuff that had volcanic ash in it, and there are no volcanoes in the area. And so this stuff must have come from somewhere. Either the ash came from somewhere or the pots came from somewhere. And so we started thinking about long distance trade in the Maya area, where traditionally people were thinking, well, these pots don't travel ceramics, too fragile, it would break, they weren't trading pots. However, they were trading obsidian or volcanic glass from these areas. So why obsidian, volcanic glass could come from the volcanic areas but not pots was a question that I posed. And I think people are still quite uncomfortable about the idea among Mayanists. But in comparing the patterns of trade in the Maya area to patterns of trade where Robert's working, it seems just so simple. The Maya area is, the size of a thumb, where the whole Eastern Mediterranean is massive, and there was trade going on all over the place, at same periods of time. So why not? Why could not the Maya be doing the same thing as was going on in the Eastern Mediterranean area? And so it's interesting because if they're two completely sort of different sub-disciplines of archaeology, Mesoamerican archaeology and archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asian basin, but you could actually say, I said, well, it happens other places. Why not here? And so using this technique is enabled to sort of make those sort of broad comparisons between what humans were doing in one place and what humans are doing in another place.
Another aspect of that is the site where I was working, a monastery. Also in the same area was this ancient sacred place. And Kay's most recent fieldwork has been in a similar location, about halfway across the world, a cave site which was a site of pilgrimage and spiritual significance. And so it's also quite interesting, and the monastery where I worked was also a cave site, and caves were important. And so looking at the commonality of human experience, how humans in very different parts of the world come up with the same solutions to things is very, very interesting, very, very important, I think. And that we can develop models about how we think this site is, say, a pilgrimage site, or a holy site, or a pottery production center, or this sort of thing. That's the sort of thing where everybody knowing each other and working together and coming out with general models of how humans behave really work, and the sort of thing we can apply to the present day, like sponsorship of industry, for instance. And the number of industries that we've seen, right, and so in this time we have order and investment, and we have wonderful pottery, and it's other time there's no investment and they get really bad pottery or something, So it's these sort of things work all the time.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think a lot of people don't realize that archaeologists will be studying us in the future. They'll be studying us, and it'd be neat to see if what we did was very similar to other people in the past. And I think to answer your initial question about archaeological practice in general, it's interesting because archaeological practice in different parts of the world, different regions, all seem to kind of vary a bit. There's more emphasis on the art historical aspects, the form, the style of pottery in certain parts of the world. Some parts of the world really enjoy the scientific analysis, and that kind of results in different sources of information, the different types of information you see about different parts of the world and those who actually practice archaeology in those parts. Because the project that I'm doing is very different, sort of, compared to you guys, because I don't have clearly defined production sites. And I'm studying a group of people who are traditionally believed to be sort of hunter-gatherers, although this definition we know is very flawed. And this dichotomy between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists isn't so black and white, and it should be viewed as more of a continuum. And it's interesting because in terms of style and form, Japan has numerous styles, dozens of styles during the Jomon period, which is very broad. But the region that I study in southwestern Hokkaido, there's only one style. It's called the Ento Castle style for the early Jomon, and it goes into the middle period after that. And it's this huge region with only one style, and it seems to be against the trend of a lot of different styles in different regions. And that's why I was interested in the petrography of the region, because if everything looked very similar and was the same sort of style in terms of form, would they be the same mineralogically? And I'm starting my analysis now, and I definitely need to sample more. I need to go to Japan, which I plan on doing next summer, and collecting clay samples and more pottery. It's just interesting to see what will happen. All this formal similarity, but are they same in terms of clays?
So maybe returning to something you said at the very beginning, Daniel, you were talking about sort of studying the past as being our roots and sort of understand how we got a tree. So let's think a little bit about how cultures do change through time, because if we're thinking about kind of where we are in the present and where we came from, how can that help us think about where we're going and kind of, or can it help us really think about where we're going and how we want to shape society, or can we not really work on that kind of a time scale?
Well, I think we can. I mean, certainly working in Maya archaeology, and 2012 just so recently passed, and I was getting a lot of questions about the end of the world and apocalypse and all that kind of stuff. But even sort of from that scale, when we're looking at some of the latest information coming out of Maya archaeology, is that, I mean, there are still thousands of Maya people in Mesoamerica to this day that have a plethora of different Maya languages and dialects, and the ancient Maya had seemed to have collapsed, or the grandeur of their civilization, and it was sort of like at around 900, it was like they melted back into the jungle, although, so something happened. And so it's called the Maya collapse. And it's been a very, very popular subject for archaeologists to try and find out, what happened to all these temples being built, everything stopped, all these hieroglyphs being carved, all the long count calendar stopped being kept, all these things stopped happening. But why? And so people have been doing research and finding out there were environmental stresses, there was drought, there was agricultural stress, there was population pressure, there was internecine warfare happening. So there are all these things happening of, civilization and collapse and transformation again. So I think there are a lot of things that we can take from this when we're thinking, oh, well, there's mercury in our rice, or things are getting contaminated, pollution, all the industry and stuff that's happening to us, and the reasons why we're turning to organic agriculture, and these kinds of things, I think, are things that archaeology can directly inform.
Similar with the present concern about 1% of the population knowing 99% of the resources is exactly the same as the end of the Bronze Age in the Middle East, which ended in bloodbath and a complete destruction of all the Bronze Age civilizations. So, and we can see these sort of things happening in the archaeological record, and we can say, we are not learning. That if the bulk of the population cannot invest in society, they will divest themselves of society, as we saw at the end of the Bronze Age. So, a lot of lessons like this.
Was it Winston Churchill? He said, like, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
Yes, yes. And things like, as I say, pollution and not preserving what we need to be sustained. In the times we've been able to see in the archaeological record, over abuse of resources leading to eventually the complete destruction of that society. And it's something our society is doing all the time. It's interesting with the Pompeii show coming up. And one of the things we're talking about, programming around that, is not just having a volcano, but having a disaster, living next to disaster, right next to you all the time, and not knowing what it is. And we can see many disasters in the archaeological record, environmental, social, that are sitting on our doorstep right now, which we can talk about in that context.
On that happy note. So there are...
So about the game jam.
Yeah,
the game jam, yeah.
It's very exciting.
We're all gamers. We're
Yes.
archaeologists.
We're all archaeologists, yes. I've been known to slay a few orcs myself.
Yeah.
No, and it's very interesting, and when you do look at games, that they are very intriguing and you get into them and all this sort of thing. But one of the things that has interested us and why we try to involve gamers in coming to the museum is to be able to put content in. And so that as you're playing a game, as you're obsessively lining things up or doing something like that or killing something, that you could be learning something at the same time. And so that is a way of reaching out to people, to teach them even though they don't want to be learning anything. But as they're lining up coins, they're learning about the reign of Claudius or something, or as they're putting on their armor, they're putting on late 14th century plate, not some fantasy armor. It's something like that, some way we can inform people, have them learn more about something from the past by having fun.
So we have a virtual bloodbath. We can maybe avoid the end of the Bronze Age.
Yeah. Well, it's like people can experience the past through a different medium, and one that's very popular right now and very accessible to younger people. Fewer and fewer kids just want to sit and read a book, and many want to sit at a computer and maybe play a game. And that's a source of sort of learning for them, and that's what we're trying to tap into.
Right. Thanks very much. So again, happy to have everyone join us at the Game Jam next week, and we'll be sharing the results of this game on October 19th, International Archaeology Day here at the ROM.